I would just like to introduce our lovely speaker, Tierney Thurmond, the founder and principal consultant of Adulto Counseling and Consulting. So let's give it up for Tierney.
Good morning. Thank you so much for that introduction. It is so good to see everyone. Welcome. So imagine this. Imagine you are at home or in your community and you see a body of water nearby, and there's one fish that just so happens to be belly up in that water. You'd probably be curious about like, oh, what happened to that fish, right? And then the next day you may walk by again and then you see like tens of thousands of fish that are belly up in that body of water. What would you then probably ask yourself or ask the body of water? What would you ask? What's wrong with the water? Thank you so much. I did see your hand. What's wrong with the water? So if any of you are familiar with the Racial Equity Institute's groundwater approach, this is essentially the metaphor that they use to talk about systemic racism, and that we are all swimming in water that is systemically racist. You know, it impacts various parts of our lives. We are ingesting it. We are drinking it. There's nothing that racism hasn't touched. And so in this morning's session, we're going to talk a little bit more about how do we move these conversations about race and racism forward on our campuses and in our institutions so that we can make systemic changes. So before we get started, I'd like to read this poem. Is anyone familiar with the Invitation to Brave Space? No? How many of you are familiar with creating a safe space? All right? So I'm going to encourage you to think about what it would be like to create a brave space on your campus. So I'm just going to read this poem for you. Together we will create brave space because there's no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and we've all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We will call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. The space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work side by side. And this poem was created by Mickey Scott B. Jones. So again, this is my invitation to welcome you into a brave space. And so if you were here the first day, you remember the phenomenal Bryan Stevenson and his call for you to get proximal. And so I've actually been using Bryan Stevenson's work for a long time, so to see him as a keynote was extraordinary, personally and professionally. But I want us to hold on to these objectives throughout our time together, and you can take these objectives into your own conversations on your campuses. So to get closer to the problem, or as Bryan said, to get proximal. To get proximal to the injustice, to get proximal to the impoverished, to get proximal to the disabled, to get proximal so that we understand the lived narratives, the stories of the individuals that we want to advocate for. That is true allyship and what it means to be an accomplice in this work. And we must be willing to change the narrative. That narrative not only about the others, but the narrative we've also ingested about ourselves and our relationship with various people. And third, a willingness to get uncomfortable, because we realize that discomfort is what leads to change. And then, of course, change comes with discomfort. And finally, maintaining hopefulness, because, as Bryan Stevenson said, hopelessness is the enemy of justice. So let's get started.
How does race come up in your brain in a daily way?
Can we have Lindsay answer that question first?
Race doesn't pop into my head every day. Just living my everyday life, that completely comes last.
I think about it all the time. And I think it's cool that you don't have to think about it because it's a huge burden.
I was raised in a very white suburban town. My whole childhood was just surrounded by people who looked like me. Race was never in the conversation so much.
I wouldn't say that I've talked about race a lot throughout my life. When the topic of race comes up, it's not something that I'm a pretty loud voice in, because I don't feel like I have the experience to be a voice in that conversation. I'm gonna try hard not to be quiet, but I'll be dealing with people who just have, I guess, a closer connection to the issues.
I feel like I was very privileged growing up, and I don't know what it feels like to be discriminated against. I don't really almost have the right to talk about it.
race is still a really big issue. I wish we lived in a world where we didn't need to talk about it, but I feel like we do.
I agree with you, Derek. Can't we all just be people? But I know that that's not real.
To say like, oh, like I'm a good white ally, I feel like inherently is like, that makes me feel uneasy.
I'm also a little uncomfortable with the term white ally. I feel like it's very separating.
Personally, I don't feel like I have anything to contribute all of the time to discussions on Facebook or like social media, so I stay absent from them.
A big important part of being an ally is being a listener.
This conversation is definitely tricky.
The fact that it's just hard to talk about just shows that we all need to get really comfortable talking about race.
I feel like I was super comfortable. We were all kind of coming from the same place, both racially but also opinion-wise.
For the most part, we had the same line of opinion. There's always a degree of awkwardness, I think, when it comes to talking about race.
Just a white guilt thing that we have to deal with.
I felt comfortable expressing myself.
It was fine.
First of all, gotta have diverse friends because someone has to talk to the cops.
Definitely.
That's number one.
Yeah.
Do you think that when people see you, the first thing they see is your blackness?
Yeah.
I always think about how that is the first thing people.
Yeah, but I love that. The definition of like what black is it's a whole nother conversation. I'm not typically a black American. My family's from the Caribbean, so it's totally different upbringing.
I made something that was made by an Asian American woman, and that means something.
Josh, do you feel that? I was wondering if like white people feel that same way. Like, do you hold that like whatever you do here?
You do as a white
man, yeah.
Not at all.
Right,
No.
and that's like the difference, I think.
Going beyond like just the loud and the violence that is being shown. This is the conversation that should be happening on TV.
When I was growing up, I didn't care. Like, I can talk to you guys and totally, care because I know you and I hear your stories,
Definitely.
but I was not surrounded by that whatsoever to even like
Right.
think about protesting for someone that I don't
And it goes.
never met even
Which
before.
is definitely very fair.
Like, it's
definitely very fair.
You
Yeah,
know-
because of all the oppression you had as someone of color, you always feel like I have to do something so the future can get better.
I think what occurred to me with the second conversation is that's the conversation we need to be having.
The second conversation, I definitely did more listening than talking. I think it's really important coming from a white male perspective to be doing more listening than talking.
I didn't feel as awkward as I thought I would in the second conversation. I almost felt better. I could actually hear everyone else's viewpoints and understand from the other side the issues.
Coming from a place of someone who hasn't had a lot of conversations about race, I think it was natural to be a little nervous, but the conversation was great.
I think they were really understanding with the fact that I grew up a certain way.
I felt like what I had to offer was accepted by others.
I think knowing now that people of different races care about my white, opinion, I feel like I can be in other conversations. I feel like this was the first step to actually being a part of this big conversation.
It can't just be a conversation within people of color. There needs to be white people in the conversation.
I appreciated the fact that Josh and Lindsay were part of the conversation.
I learned some really eye-opening things. Now that I've just kind of dipped my toes in this candid conversation about race, it's totally something I'd be interested in taking part in again.
I don't feel as scared. I feel like I can connect to people that aren't like me. It's just important to come together and be a part of that conversation.
Listen, have empathy, try to find a way how you can try to change it from your personal point of view. That's pretty much it.
Don't be scared. Step forward and just talk. That's the first step.
I appreciate that BuzzFeed video because it chronicles the discomfort that white people usually have in having these conversations about race, but people of color have had a different experience with that because many of us, coming from various homes, we most likely we had to talk at a decent age, and if you didn't, you've been in various spaces where your identity has been challenged, you've been microaggressed, you've been curious about why you had that odd experience, and then you're trying to share it with someone else that doesn't really understand, they're not picking up what you're putting down. So we're all having a racialized experience, and that's why I greatly appreciate Robin DiAngelo's quote. The primary goal for white people working to understand racism is not to learn how racism impacts people of color. The primary goal is to recognize how the system of racism shapes our lives and how we uphold that system and how we might interrupt it. So considering what you just watched on this film, on that short clip, you're going to get into some groups. You can talk to your partner, turn around and talk to someone. But I want you to consider this particular question, or these questions. What makes you comfortable or uncomfortable about having a conversation about race and racism? And then why are conversations about racism so challenging to have? Thank you so much. I wasn't able to make out all of what you were saying, but I was watching your facial expressions, and I was like, you all were having some really detailed and in-depth conversations. And so I'd be honored to have maybe a volunteer or two to just share out. Thank you. One here and one here first. Yes, you with the lanyard, black shirt.
Hi, I'm Kate Beebe. I'm a graduate assistant at University of Wisconsin Parkside. I was talking to Jasmine, she was my partner, and we were just talking about, so for me, what makes me uncomfortable about having a conversation about race or racism, and what makes conversations about racism so hard is that the unpredictability of not knowing exactly where that person is in their journey with understanding racism. So somebody could be understanding and wanting to have dialogue with you, whereas other people may be only in that space where they're ready to be argumentative. So it's kind of like Jasmine said, it's not a me versus you conversation, but having people understand that it's a me and you versus the problem conversation. So, yeah.
Thank you. It's almost like saying maybe we aren't, but hopefully we're on the same team, and racism is the thing we're trying to destroy, we're trying to dismantle. Thank you so much for your contribution. And one here.
I have a great gym voice, so I don't need that. Hi, my name is Sonia Hopkins. I'm at Butler University, and this was an awesome conversation I just had with these three young men. They're all student athletes, and they all come from different backgrounds and countries, and and so 4 different perspectives, right? But we appreciate the quote that you put up about interrupting. And so I think that we all came to the conclusion that we want to just interrupt what has been, and so that we can have a better place to be, a better place to live, a better place to love. But one said that they were uncomfortable because they've been raised by white parents, and so they just didn't think that they would understand. One said that they were a white male and he just doesn't know enough to be able to contribute. One said he has a perspective that might not be the same perspective of someone else because of his experiences. And mine is, challenges being in the workplace and how far can you go when you're speaking about race. So 4 different perspectives, but we all agree that we just want to teach people and help people understand that it's okay to treat people with kindness.
Yeah. Thank you, thank you. Now, I did say 2 volunteers, but does anyone have a different perspective than okay, now I see 2 more. May I have you with the jacket and you in the black coat?
I'm Faith Stevenson. I'm a freshman at Frostburg State University. I think my perspective is a little different because I am biracial. So when I'm with my mom, sometimes it's people think I'm white and I don't get these looks. But then when I'm with my dad, we've had people follow us around the store before because they think we're stealing so I have experienced racism from both sides. So I think it's just I have both perspectives of in the conversation, and I can say yeah, my mom doesn't get these things, but she's still able to realize that other people in our family do, and she's informed herself. So I think if people just inform themselves and realize what other people have to go through, it'll be it's just you have to have these conversations.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jo. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a sophomore at Arcadia University. I think I sort of have a unique perspective on this because I am white, but I did not grow up in a predominantly white area. I grew up in a predominantly Asian area. So we had conversations like this at school since I was a little kid. So it can still be uncomfortable because I'm afraid of saying something wrong. I'm a little bit more comfortable having conversations on race because from a young age, I confronted that uncomfortability and did my best to ensure that I was listening more than I was talking.
Thank you. Thank you. I promise you, those of you who wanted to contribute will have have another opportunity to contribute. Thank you so much for those of you who volunteered and were vulnerable. I want to highlight a few contemporary issues that many of us, if you're in sport, you've been paying attention to. And even if you weren't paying attention to them, they were brought to your attention somehow. And the first photograph is Dawn Staley, and the article is titled, "Dawn Staley Calls Out Media for Narrative Around South Carolina's Play Style. We're Not Bar Fighters." So the media regularly, even if you are working diligently to be anti-racist, the media regularly crafts narratives that are inherently racist about people that aren't white. When we think about this, what does it mean? What is it implying about her players being bar fighters? What is it implying? Yes. They are aggressive. Anything else? They're violent. They're angry. They play dirty. Yes. Ooh, socioeconomic status. So when we read these narratives, and then we see this particular narrative, Angel Reese, LSU and Iowa, right? This reminds me to our first night when we watched the Loyola Project, and that was in the 60s, but the narrative was still this idea that these black men were aggressive, they didn't play fair, they came from maybe unsettled spaces, so on and so forth. And we think about Angel Reese and the narrative that's not only projected about black players, but also black women, or black female players. And not just in sport, but in a multitude of spaces. Because remember, there's nothing that racism hasn't touched. It touches everything. It's an ism. There's power behind it. This narrative that pushes that if one person, why is it that one person can do it but the other can't? And that leads me to my next question. What does inclusion look like in light of the double standards levied against black players or black athletes? I'll give you a moment to consider this, but I'd like for there to be some, share out if you're willing to. Yes.
I think it's about addressing unconscious bias as well. And I think that some of the double standards and the narratives that are portrayed are rooted in folks' own bias over the identities that people hold. And in particular, in what you just shared out, the narrative around black women in sport.
What she essentially said is that it's rooted in unconscious bias. These biases that people inherently have about players, about women, and that narrative plays out in a multitude of spaces and places. Would you feel more comfortable talking to your partner about it, and then sharing out? So again, reflecting on the two photographs you just saw, the two articles, and highlighting the disparity, the narrative that's usually mentioned about black players. The question again was, what does inclusion look like in light of the double standards levied against black athletes? Now, is there maybe a volunteer from this side and a volunteer from this side before we move forward?
So when you're looking at what inclusion would look like in light of the double standards, for me it would be, I'm sorry, my name's Carrie Ortiz, I'm from Move United. But for me, it would be a black athlete, especially as a female athlete, being able to come as your authentic self without being deemed as aggressive or mean or making people feel uncomfortable or afraid. Because I know with me, some of my athletes, my teammates, if I'm sitting there and I'm looking focused or, I'm intense or aggressive, but when the media talks about them, it's, they're focused, they're ready, So what's the difference in me sitting there looking ready for the ball versus them? It's just who I am, So I think that that's something we could fix.
Strong feelings. We're all playing a competitive sport, but I'm not entitled to show up fully and big and take up space because it's considered threatening to someone else. And the other piece of this is that, unfortunately, the individual that gets to write about the lives of others doesn't always come from that same lived experience. So again, it goes back to my friend's comment about the unconscious bias here. So what I also want to highlight, well, first of all, let me ask this. How many of you had formal, organized conversations on your campus about what I just showed you? So a very small percentage of you all had organized conversations about this particular topic. So how do we move these conversations forward? And first I have to say this, language matters. Language matters. And decolonizing the language and reframing the conversation on race is so important. But there are three things I want to highlight. The first is we regularly talk about, the acronym BIPOC, which nothing against this, but I want to give you some new terminology for you to consider. BIPOC, people of color, so on and so forth. What if you considered saying something more affirming, such as the global majority? Because people of color are the global majority. So people of the global majority, decentering whiteness and affirming the lives of people of color that make up nearly 80% of the world's population. So instead of, because many times when we use these acronyms, LGBTQ, BIPOC, there's an assumption that people that are part of that acronym all have the same experience. And we know that that isn't true. We understand, we think about the global majority, we're thinking about the globe, we're thinking about the diversity of Africa and that being a continent, we're thinking about the diversity of Europe, we're thinking about the diversity of Latin America and the various countries that make that up. We're thinking about individuals that are brown and speak another language. We're thinking about the global majority. And white people are not, but we center whiteness in so much of our rhetoric. The next one is minoritized. How many of you are familiar with minority or minorities? So this word actually came up in the literature recently with Sean Harper, who does a lot of writing around race and higher education. It is not a new term, but it just showed up a lot in his documentation. There's a difference between the noun and the adjective, because it's less about numbers and more about lived experience, particularly experience of historical oppression that has regulated people to the margins, inclusive of systemic inequalities, oppression, and marginalization that has deemed individuals the minority status. It's really interesting how you could be the global majority, but in literature you're named the minority, or in many spaces that you've been isolated, or you've been regulated to the margins, and so you're deemed the minority in that space. Years ago, multicultural affairs, EEO, was like minority affairs, because the idea was making sure that we made sure that, the idea was that we made sure that students of color, at the time particularly black students and Hispanic students, felt that they were welcomed. But the word minority feels small, doesn't it? It feels small. And finally, if any of you are familiar with the book, by show of hands, the book is called My Grandmother's Hands. It's about racialized trauma. Okay, so a few of you are, and many of you aren't. The book is titled My Grandmother's Hands, and I can't remember the subline to it right now, but it's written by Resna Minikin, and his name is in this particular word. Resna Minikin refers to bodies of color as bodies of culture. That does not mean that white people don't have culture. It just means that many times when we talk to white people about their culture, it's like, I don't have one. It just is. And people of color tend to live more pronouncedly in their bodies embody culture. They talk about it, they breathe it, they talk about their cultural origins. And if you're familiar with Yasso's community of cultural wealth, it's rooted in who I am. There's also this term in higher ed, it's called spotlight anxiety, meaning that when I'm in a classroom space or when I'm on the field, I'm not only representing my family, I'm representing my race. So many people of color are embodying their culture, they're embodying their color, they're embodying their race on a regular, at any given time. And even if they aren't, they are regularly reminded of it. So again, Resna Minikin's term, bodies of culture. Again, it is body affirming. And Resna Minikin also talks a lot about embodiment. So if any of you are familiar with trauma therapy, I'm a licensed therapist, so if you're familiar with trauma therapy, you may be familiar with somatic healing, so understanding where the hurt shows up in your body and paying attention to it. Feel free to take photos. I can also send you this presentation at the end if you like. Okay. Now, my question now is, why are these conversations important? The conversation about Dawn Staley, the conversation about Angel Reese, the conversation about minoritized and bodies of culture, and how do we create space to have meaningful ones? And I like to say it's important because structural racism is ever present. And racism operates on 4 levels: internal or intrapersonal, my relationship with you, your relationship with me, institutional, and structural. So when we think about the way racism shows up, many of us talk about it kind of freely, like, well, how do you dismantle these systems? And we dismantle them in various ways. And voting politically is one way in which we dismantle racism. Fighting for equitable housing, fighting for access to our institutions. One way, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, on an institutional level, how we disrupt racism is looking at the data. What does the data say about how students of color are showing up in academic spaces? And what are we doing collectively to train faculty and staff, to mitigate bias, to ensure that they are not maintaining the status quo and are using culturally relevant and culturally competent pedagogy in their classroom spaces? Which essentially means you're teaching in a way that connects with the students that you're working with. Sometimes you're in classrooms, you're like, Professor Johnson, what did you just say? What does that mean? Internalized racism shows up in ways like spotlight anxiety. It shows up in imposter syndrome. It shows up in ways of, how many of you are familiar with black on black crime? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you are familiar with horizontal hostility? Only a few. There's no such thing as black on black crime. The term is horizontal hostility, which is a sociological construct which essentially means that people perpetuate harm in close proximity. You're most likely to harm someone if you live near them. You're most likely to harm someone if you're in a residence hall nearby. But black on black crime was a term that was coined in the late 80s, early 90s to perpetuate this narrative that people of color, particularly black people, were harmful, that they were uncivilized, that they participate in the bar fight analogy. Is perpetuating a narrative about black people. And that narrative is also internalized. So many times we try not to show up in a way that is stereotypical, which then is this idea of stereotype threat. Anyone familiar with that term, stereotype threat? If you aren't, stereotype threat is essentially me thinking about all the stereotypes that exist about my humanity and trying diligently to not show up in a way that confirms or validates those stereotypes. So it's me thinking about what you're thinking about, so I don't show up in a way that validates what you're thinking about. That's a lot of thinking about other things outside of myself. And it makes it really difficult for you to show up authentically if you're trying to show up in a way that is counterintuitive or that doesn't validate that particular stereotype that person has about you, or you assume has about you. So again, the 4 levels of racism. And these conversations are important on our campuses because these levels of racism constantly exist, but they also perpetuate harm. And this harm impacts how students show up in classrooms. It impacts how you play on a field, how you show up in your family. And I want you to consider racial trauma, big T and little t trauma. Going back to those 2 articles, reading about Angel Reese, reading about Dawn Staley, those could be considered little t traumas. The idea that small microaggression that happened in class when your professor says, "You speak so articulately," or "I see you're on time today, that's different." Those could be considered little t traumas, those little like micro blades of insults, those paper cuts, so that we call them. But there's also big T trauma, like seeing a man die on national television. There's also big T trauma when you see your favorite rap artist who's also just been slain, or you hear police officers not being, facing the appropriate time or whatnot for offending a black body. There's a term that's called spirit murder, and these encounters murder the spirit of our students. They murder our personal spirit. That again, spirit murder is essentially the idea that if racism can murder my spirit, then we should also find a way to penalize people for murdering the spirit of people through racist acts. It's murdering their spirit. So racial trauma refers to the physical and psychological symptoms that BIPOC experience, again, Black, Indigenous, and people of color experience after exposure to particularly distressing and or life-threatening racist experiences by white supremacist people, policies, and systems. It is highly possible, highly probable that there are systems at play in your institutions, in your athletic programs, in your classrooms that are upholding white supremacist ideology and that are causing racial trauma to your students. Or even to the young people that are in the room, you may have experienced that. So having the conversations about racism, having the conversations about race, and becoming skilled at interrupting our thoughts about such are important so that we don't perpetuate this little t and big T trauma. Next. Anyone familiar with W.B. Du Bois and double consciousness? Okay. Appreciate it. For those of you who aren't, Du Bois says that, he talks about double consciousness. It is a particular sensation, is this double consciousness, this idea that our students, I see someone shaking her head feverishly in the back, this double consciousness that many of our students of color embody, this idea of showing up one way in the world and showing up differently in the places that are intimate to them, with their family, with their friends. It's also this way in which we code switch. If any of you are familiar with code switching, yes, I heard someone say yes. Code switching. And code switching can be such a difficult thing to do because you're contorting your body, your voice to ensure that you are safe. But it's also a safety mechanism. But double consciousness, according to Du Bois, is that it's a particular sensation. It's double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of the world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels this two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideas in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. That sounds weighty. So creating safe spaces for our students to articulate their needs, have their needs be addressed, to be seen, again, is so important. And then the other piece, I want to talk about this on a micro level. These various maladaptive coping strategies that our students may utilize to ensure that they keep themselves safe, but again are quite fatiguing. These coping strategies consist of Superwoman syndrome. So young women of color work themselves tirelessly because there's this notion that my worth is defined by my work. I have to keep going. I have to keep going. And this ultra or hyper independence sometimes keeps them from getting proper adequate support because they don't know how to ask for support. So again, for the administrators, for the leaders in the room, it's important to be able to say, hey, I see you working really hard. What's going on? How are you resting? Let's talk a little bit about how this is showing up in your, I see that you're making really good grades and you're doing extremely well, but what's suffering? Is it your body? Is it your mind? Like where are you hurting? Let's talk about this. And the other one that we don't talk about a lot, but it shows up a lot in black men, particularly black boys, is John Henryism. John Henryism, anyone familiar with John Henry? Okay, or John Henryism. John Henryism is high effort coping. Again, going back to this idea that I have to keep going. And John Henryism is this idea, like working on the railroad. And this high effort coping, unfortunately, these traditional coping methods, this idea of being full of grit and resilience, it just further perpetuates these feelings of distress. You can't just work yourself through it. Like you have to be mindful and you have to ask for help. You have to be supported. And again, these are ways in which these issues of racism plague our students and also show up in your black colleagues, your colleagues of color, their bodies. And again, they show up for the students because they have to keep going. The idea they have to keep going. So we just moved from the micro to let's think about the macro for a second, and then how it shows up in our institutional spaces. Healing racial trauma requires self-care on the individual, and it also requires community care responses. So let's think about that for a moment. Has anyone had an experience on their campus where it seemed like the campus issued a statement really quickly and there was little to no follow-through or follow-up? Yeah. Yeah. So, unfortunately, that just perpetuates harm. You have to keep having the conversations, and the conversations have to come before the encounters. Because one thing we know for sure is that if the system is always working, that means that we have to always be working. And I also want to be honest, because I see there are a number of people of color in the room today, and I have to let you all know that it is not your job to dismantle racism. It is your job to work to heal from racist ideologies and the impact of racism on your body. I have to ask my white counterparts in the room, like, it is your job to also educate yourself about how the system impacts your life and the lives of other people so that you can do what's necessary to dismantle that system, because your black colleagues, your black students, your other students of color are really tired of being microaggressed. Like, it's fatiguing. The racial trauma it's too big. And it's too much to shoulder. I have another video that I want to highlight because I want to share with you how the narratives are different when it comes to these lived experiences. I want to utilize this video to highlight the various narratives and some of the lived experiences that, in this particular case, a black family goes through. So take a moment to review this.
If you think you know what happens next, ask yourself why. These are the black stories we've been shown. A narrow view that limits our understanding. But there's so much more to see. Of black life. Let's widen the screen so we can widen our view.
I want you all to know that I executive produced that video. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But if I did, that meant I had some exceptional skills, right? That was a really touching video, right? It was so touching. I know, I did do well. You're right, I did, thank you. I did well by selecting that video to add to this presentation because I knew that you all needed to see it so that you can add it to your repertoire to utilize in your trainings and your conversations the next time you host a power hour or a lunch and learn with your students or with your faculty and staff to kind of dismantle these various narratives that we've ingested about people of color. And also create a better curriculum so that we can ensure that we're moving the dismantleization of these systems forward. So we're moving we're moving our institutions forward. All right, and these conversations are important because, and I'm sure you all mentioned some of this, and I'm sure you thought about this when you were when I posed the question a little bit earlier, because the system of racism impacts all of us, but differently. No one's unscathed. No one goes unscathed from racism, from the various forms of capitalism, from heterosexism. And healing reparation can only come from truth-telling and story sharing. That's another reason why it's important for you to gather and have these conversations. Being silent is upholding the status quo. Unchecked bias, as my colleague said earlier, can lead to violence and genocide. It has historically, and it seems like we're in a new wave of that now. And because our collective liberation is bound to each other. So, when you're thinking about having these conversations on your campus, utilize, if any of you are familiar with the Courageous Conversation Compass, this is a really great tool to utilize when you're thinking about having these conversations. So, considering that we are all operating, all of us kind of operate in the inside of this compass. We think about things from a moral lens based upon what's right and wrong or our faith. We think about it from an intellectual lens. Well, statistically, yada, yada, yada. And from this relational space, my relationship as I can't remember your name, my friend here, Faith. Faith said earlier about her relationship with her parents and the experience she has when she's with her father versus the experience she has when she's with her dad. And many times we count on those relational experiences as means of grounding ourselves in our understanding of race and race relations, which is one way, but there's also a greater experience being had. What the things that are being said and the things that go unsaid, we're still in relationship with that. And then finally, the emotional piece. The idea that I don't want to have that conversation, or I do want to have the conversation because it bothers me, it aches me, it scares me. I don't want to talk about it because it's uncomfortable. But it's really important for us to think about the things that are happening on the outside too. The acting, the feeling, the thinking, the believing. So when you are considering having these conversations, encourage participants to be mindful of the 4 ways in which they are showing up. What they believe about the encounter, what they're thinking about the encounter, emotionally what they feel about the encounter, and then of course how they acting in that space. It's heart, mind, body, and spirit or soul if you want to consider that too. Saying that you're anti-racist or not perpetuating racism or not saying that thing that you were thinking about does not mean that you aren't perpetuating harm in other areas. And when you're having these conversations, it's important to have community requests or ground rules. How many of you facilitate these conversations on your campus? Okay, so I'm sure you're already using some ground rules to guide you. Here are a few more. Of course, share your experience and step up and step back. The bottom 2 are listen for understanding, not for responding. And of course, practice self-care. But the ones that I really want to highlight are the ones in yellow. Assume good intent, but take care of impact. Assume good intent essentially means it's important for a participant to assume that the person that is, sharing in that space has good intentions. However, it's important to also be mindful of the impact. And that little asterisk is there because to be mindful of culture. Many times, particularly for people from historically marginalized backgrounds, they are regularly extending the benefit of the doubt to other people. So if your idea is, my intentions are pure and not of malice, just be mindful that in some spaces, people have been extending the benefit of the doubt all week long, where it's like, I'm sure they didn't mean to leave that door, let that door hit me. Oh, I'm sure he didn't mean to mansplain to me. Or, I'm not going to say anything about how he put my money on the counter and didn't touch my hand and give it to me. I'm originally from the South, and I grew up seeing that happen with my grandmother. It was very common. And so no one had to talk about racism. I knew that feeling was uncomfortable of seeing the money touch the counter and not touch my grandmother's hands. The other one is take the lesson but leave the story. Is essentially honoring confidentiality. Take the lesson but leave the story. It is not appropriate for you to leave the sacred space and say, well, you know that Ashley had this encounter last week where this and this and this happened with Coach so-and-so. No, the lesson was that maybe there's room for our coach to grow in his or her understanding of racial equality, and this is a way in which we could possibly share that with him or her or they or them. Lean into the discomfort. We have talked about that a ton this weekend. Bryan Stevenson spoke about it. I'm sure you've been hearing about it in your sessions. Lean into the discomfort. And then expect and accept non-closure. You and I have been together for 1 hour and 20 minutes. I would love to change your entire life in this session. But the idea is that we're just planting seeds. And you will water that, you will nurture it, you will provide it with some sunlight. Some of you may not. But the idea is that you expect and accept non-closure. Not all the encounters are going to be resolved. We're not going to eradicate racism today, but it's important for us to think about what we are doing regularly to ensure that we're dismantling it in our life, in the lives of other people that we are protecting, providing for, and of course, teaching. And as we wrap up, I just want to share with you a few suggestions for sustaining the work. You all saw the diagram a little bit earlier, so I've created a few things for you to consider as it pertains to how we can combat racism on the internalized, interpersonal, institutional, and structural level. First, using policy analysis to identify the gaps. I cannot stress this enough. When we're thinking about funding, getting funding, securing that funding, you have to utilize policy analysis. Consider, any of my executives in the room utilize the MCOD model. MCOD is the Multicultural Organizational Development Model, using that model, or utilizing the the Association for American Colleges and Universities Inclusive Excellence Framework. For my students that are in the room, you may be thinking, what is she talking about? Google it. Google it. Google it because it'll provide you with some insight, or even look on your university website to see what framework are they using, what are the outcomes, what are the inputs, how are they measuring this stuff. You know, they told us that we were going to get this, but it doesn't look like it's happening. Where are they in the process? Build a solid kitchen table. I stole this kitchen table analogy from Michelle Obama. She and I are really good friends. I had dinner with her the other night. You know, yeah, I'm manifesting these things. You all know that, right? Exactly. I'm manifesting being the executive producer of a video and being friends with Michelle Obama. But in doing the work, it's important to have an executive kitchen table that consists of advisors that are going to support you in this work. Mentors, skilled disruptors. This is so important. Who are the skilled disruptors? You can't just be an agitator. How can you utilize your strengths, your collaborative skill set, your research insight to ensure that you are disrupting these systems? Accomplices, allies, and self-care advocates. There's no way you can do this work without taking good care of yourself. Resting, reading, massages, family time, facials, giving to yourself and to others. And this was brought up in a conversation I had yesterday with some colleagues at the table, and it was about triage. Many times our CDOs, or our chief diversity officers and such, are somewhat those people that sometimes triage these major happenings on our campus. But we need to have a body of people who can help with that. Who are your therapists on campus, your licensed psychologists, your social workers? How can they be a part of your kitchen table so that when something happens, because it will, there are skilled individuals that can triage or support you in triaging the matter, and also help you draft the response to when said thing, when that particular encounter takes place. And consistently advocating for fiscal support. You have to have money to do this work. Next, support and sponsor racial identity development models. Support and sponsor racial identity development programming. There are social studies on how you came to be. There's Helms' white identity development model. So how did you become white? There's Bill Cross's negrescence model, which is the how did you become black? We grow into these identities through various encounters that we've had. There's a biracial identity development model. There's an Asian American identity development model. And I'll make sure to share those models with Naya, and so when you all want to, you can access the PDFs to see what those models consist of. There's a Latino development model, and also offer race-based affinity spaces and caucuses, and of course supporting those spaces too. And administer surveys to measure the outcomes of initiatives and impact on climate, and of course climate change for your campus. All right. Any questions? We have 5 minutes left. If not, I also have, please, thank you so much for your participation. I'll still be here to answer any questions. My email is on the screen, our website. You can also, the QR code takes you to our website. Feel free to keep in touch. I'm not I'm not a consultant that spams you. I don't have like newsletters that I'm going to send you and marketing materials. But maybe I should manifest that. Tisk, tisk. I'm just kidding. But any questions, comments? Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, 2 questions.
First of all, you were excellent. You are really a shining example of this work, and so I just wanted to add maybe one thing to your rules of engagement for the Courageous Conversations. You mentioned Coach so-and-so did so-and-so. What has worked for me is to not mention names. I say don't use names to protect the innocent, unless someone has done something really positive and we can celebrate that person. Because, you're sort of putting negative things in the atmosphere, even if it's just said in that room about someone. So I one of my rules of engagement is just not to use names while you're explaining a scenario that may have happened.
That's good. That's a great way to stay safe. Keep yourself safe and others safe. Absolutely. And that goes beyond the take the lesson, leave the story. I appreciate that.
Hi there. I agree. This was a great presentation. What is the best way to be a skill disruptor? Do you start at the top? Do you start with an ally? What do you do?
Great question. I think the most important thing is understanding the landscape of your institution, because it is very different for each institution. It's very different for each organizational structure. So when we think about disrupting, it's important to figure out, I had a colleague that used to say, tyranny, be mindful of the landmines. And so it is really important for you to know where the landmines are and how do you get proximal, because landmines exist mostly because someone or some structure within that organization has not gotten their needs met. So how do we ensure that we're getting proximal to understanding the capacity and the challenges that our institution is facing, and also understanding the history, like doing the institutional research. As my students used to say, Ms. Thurman, you need to know who the old heads are. No like age bias. Just being curious about who's been there long enough, who can give you a little bit of insight as to what's going on, and realizing what your strength is going to be. And I think about, I am more of a teacher facilitator, but there are people who are very much like going for the juggler. Like I'm not really skilled in that area. Maybe I'll manifest that too, But when we think about disruption, it's important to understand where the money is, where the institutional challenges are, and who are the people that are most proximal that can support you and in disrupting the status quo. I think that many times we kind of gather with people that remind us of us. We have to ensure that our kitchen table consists of people that are very different strengths than we do, so that we can craft the right message, so that we can go to the right people to get our needs met. I think that's just one way in which we can become skill disruptors, because you have to become competent in this, and competent and then confident in being able to do it. Yes. Thank you for that question.
If you don't mind me asking, what pivotal life experience did you have that set you forward on this path? Because, I've turned a lot of negative in my life into positive, and I see people with similar stories to mine kind of turn away from it. If you don't mind me asking.
I don't mind you, and that's an extraordinary question, and 2 things come to mind. I grew up in a predominantly white community in Northeast Georgia, and through a program that I was in high school, because I was this exceptionally bright student, I went on an exchange program to Selma, Alabama. So could you imagine what it's like for me being at a predominantly white high school and going to a high school for just a week that was 98% black? That was the first time in my entire life that I'd been in a space like that, aside from church on Sunday and being with my own family. And being in Selma High School, was like, oh, I want this experience like all the time. And so I attended a historically black college for undergrad, which gave me that experience somewhat. And it also gave meaning to some of the experiences that I had in my small town in Northeast Georgia. Like it told, you know, it validated and affirmed some of those experiences. Like, oh, that's why I had that, and that's why I had that. So I would say that's one part. But even when it relates to sports, I ran track in high school. And I remember at our spring banquet, my last name is Thurmond, and so that means in alphabetical order that I was going to get my like honorary, you know, my what is it, scholar athlete certificate at the end of the alphabet. And I remember they kept going, and I didn't get my award. And I remember my mom saying, Tyranny, I thought you made good grades this semester. I said, Mom, I did. And not only was I supposed to get my certificate, I was also supposed to get my letter on my jacket, because I had a letterman's jacket. And some days go by, I confront the athletic director, and he says, Tyranny, I'm so sorry. Mind you, that I would have been the only black student to receive this award. And I remember having to receive that certificate in his office. It was never like spoken about ever again, but that was one of the experiences going to Savannah State University. And the other piece when it comes to clinical mental health, because I'm a practitioner, is because I grew up with a family member that had a mental illness. And it has been really important for me to ensure that I'm advocating and I'm talking about mental health in various spaces that I show up in. So those are the few that come to mind.
Hello, my name is Subi Mutebi, and I play football at Presbyterian College. And if I were to add one thing to the double standards, a question about how do we make athletes feel more included in our teams and in our universities, I say it really boils down to the coaches, honestly. Like, we need more coaches at this forum. Like, I see a lot of ADs and a lot of faculty and administration, which is cool. I appreciate all y'all being here, but if we're going to be totally honest, we need more coaches here to learn about these things and to implement them into our colleges and onto our teams, because I've had situations where, you know, a coach is oblivious or ignorant to the problems that we're going through, like, especially all the events in 2020. I mean, this was back in high school, but, you know, still, like, for a coach to not speak about issues until months and months later, and your team is made up of a lot of black athletes, it's like, it's difficult almost to, like, still respect that coach. And then get into college, and now you have a coach that is forcing you to do certain things because of his beliefs or whatnot, not listening to his athletes, not understanding that his athletes are going through certain things and stand up for certain things. I think that's important in order to make sure that we don't have those double standards at different campuses. Like, we need to have more coaches at these places, having these coaches involved in these conversations, like not just faculty and administration here, but the people who are interacting with these athletes daily. So.
I agree. It becomes a form of erasure when people don't acknowledge when they don't acknowledge what's going on and be curious about how it may be impacting you. It's a form of erasure. Thank you so much for that. Yes.
My question is, how would we encourage people who may be unwilling to have these conversations? I think that especially relates to the previous question, because many times just people who are perpetuating, these harmful ideas are, unwilling to kind of come to the table and be vulnerable and have these conversations and confront themselves.
The question was, how do we have these conversations with people who may be unwilling? How do you know they're unwilling? That's my question back to you. How do you know they're unwilling to have these conversations?
I mean, through personal interaction and also when we open up spaces. So I'm our school and the school that I come from, we opened up a DEI board to all student athletes to come in and speak on issues that they may find. Also for advocates and allies also to learn host dialogues like this, and oftentimes it's the same people coming over and over again. And so I know that it's scheduled is one thing. I know we're over time, sorry, but I know also from speaking to those teammates as well, is that they were just not interested.
Yeah.
So how do we push change forward when there is that kind of lack of interest?
Yeah. There are a few different ways in which I want to answer this particular question. One way is being mindful that when it comes to systems of racism, sometimes the greatest person that you can impact is going to be self. And many times that level of commitment to self, that wellness for self, it attracts people that are also committed to that work. So you're most likely going to end up building a community of people that are reminding you of you and that are also allies and accomplices and anti-racist, commitment-oriented people. And I think first and foremost, there has to be a level of empowerment in self before you can even confront other individuals. And I want to be cautious about the word confront because many people think confrontation is about being aggressive. Confrontation is about broaching. It's about broaching uncomfortable topics. It is about highlighting something that so you can bring it to the attention of another person. And it could be, hey, I noticed that you haven't attended our X, Y, and Z meetings. It would really be a value for you to come, even if you just came to listen for a moment. I think it would mean a lot. Extending that invitation. Now, the other piece is if someone comes and they are there to disrupt progress, then that's a different conversation. But I would say that it's really important to start off with making sure that you are well enough to take on those moments of broaching, because otherwise it could destroy your own spirit that you are inviting someone or you are extending the envelope to someone and they're not interested, or they're aggressive or nasty or hurtful. You all, we are over time.
Yeah, one more round of applause for Tierney.
Yeah.